Hi everyone, welcome to Practical English. Today we're going to be learning English from a podcast. Now podcasts are great to practice your English because there's a few things you can do with them that aren't so easy to do with other things like a book or a TV show or a movie or something like that. So the first one is with a podcast, it's very easy to go back 10 seconds or to go forward 10 seconds. So if you miss something, it's very easy to go back and just listen to it again. If something's too easy, you can skip forward. Another thing you can do is you can slow them down or speed them up when you're listening to them if it's too hard or too easy. You can also listen to podcasts pretty much anywhere. So you could be on the bus, you could be walking to school, you could be working to work, anything like that, and you can listen to a podcast as you're doing that. And the last thing to think about is with a lot of podcasts, it's actually possible to go and get a transcript. And a transcript is just a document that has all of the words that are said in that podcast. So it's almost like a script of the podcast. If you get stuck with something, it's always possible to go back and read that script and just follow through. And if maybe it's your first time listening to podcasts or it's a little difficult for you, one thing you can do is listen and also read it at the same time. So today we're going to jump in. We're going to take a look at a podcast called This American Life. It's one of the biggest podcasts in the world. And this is one that has a transcript. You can find the link in the description. So in this podcast, what we're going to do is I'm going to look through the first part of the podcast and I'm going to pick out 3 really important scenes from it that are going to help you understand the main character and also the story as a whole. So what I recommend is follow this guide all the way through and then go and listen to the podcast itself and try and listen to the whole thing all of the way through. So this podcast is about an American writer called David Sederis who lives in Paris. And in this section, he takes the host, whose name is Ira Glass, on a tour of Paris. And this is a little bit different to what you might expect on a tour of Paris because he doesn't really like touristy things and he doesn't go to anywhere touristy. And so it's quite interesting to get a picture of someone who lives in Paris but who isn't interested in all of those touristy parts of Paris. And so instead we get to see places that are interesting to him personally. And I think maybe because he's a little bit weird, some of these places are a little bit weird too. The other thing I think is really interesting about this podcast is this is a person who lives in Paris but doesn't speak a lot of French. So a lot of the places he goes to on this tour are kind of places that are based around him not speaking much French. So I picked this podcast because firstly, I just think it's quite sweet to hear this nervous guy talking about being nervous about speaking a second language in a country where that language is very commonly spoken. But also because I think for a lot of learners, how can I live in a country where I don't speak perfect English or I don't speak perfect French or I don't speak perfect whatever language is a really big question for a lot of people. So I hope by kind of learning a bit about David Sederis' experiences in Paris, we can also kind of understand what it's like to live in a country where you don't speak the language and some of the ways he copes with that. So let's jump in. So in this clip, we're going to meet the main character of the story, which is David Sederis, and they meet near the Louvre, which is a famous museum in Paris. Now in this clip, they're also going to discuss Notre Dame, which is a church in Paris, which has sadly kind of burnt down quite famously since this episode was recorded. They also talk about the Pantheon, which is an old temple in Greece, that he thinks people often go on vacation and spend a lot of time visiting tourist sites because they feel that they have to rather than because they want to. And so to make this argument, what he's going to do is say that when they're in their hometown, most people don't spend their time going to museums or going to other touristy sites. They only do it on vacation. And so his logic is kind of, you wouldn't do this at home. It's probably not interesting to you on vacation. And that's why he doesn't visit any of these places when he's in Paris.
So you've lived in Paris for how long?
2 years. But I still haven't visited it. I didn't see the point. Why come to Paris and go to the one place where you're not allowed to smoke? As a matter of fact, it's my goal to be the only person who's come to Paris and has never set foot in the Louvre.
You live how far from here?
I'm probably about a 12-minute walk, 15-minute walk from the Louvre. I mean, I'm close to Notre Dame, too, but I've never gone in there either. And it just doesn't interest me. I mean, I think so many people come here and they feel like they have to do certain things because somebody told them to do it, or that they're going to go home and people will say, what do you mean you didn't see the Pantheon? What do you mean you didn't go into the Louvre? So I'm guessing that a good number of these people are just standing here because somebody told them that they should do it.
Well,
I don't think that they're all museum goers at home. I don't know, do people like look back and remember the experience of standing in front of a painting?
So in this clip, there are a few sentences I want to review. So the first one is, why come to Paris and go to the only place where you're not allowed to smoke? Now, in English, we call this a rhetoric question, and it's a type of question where you're not really looking for an answer. You're kind of asking maybe to make a point. The whole podcast, you'll know that David really loves smoking cigarettes in this podcast. He talks about it a lot. And so when he says this sentence, he isn't actually looking for a reason to go to this museum. He's more saying, if I can't smoke there, I won't go there. But this is just a more powerful, interesting way of saying it. The second thing that might be quite useful or interesting in this clip is the phrase museum goers. Now, that just means people who go to museums in general. But it's really useful to know this because this ending, like dash goers, can be used for all sorts of things. So once you know what museum goers mean, you also know what cinema goers mean, vacation goers mean, theatre goers, wrestling goers, basketball match goers, any kind of goers. So this is a really useful phrase to go because it's very adaptable. We can use it in lots of different ways. Okay, so this second clip is about going to the shops. And now, because David in this podcast is a very nervous person, he's very scared of speaking French to shop owners. And so a lot of the places he goes are based around him being nervous speaking French. So he goes to shops where he knows he can speak French without the people minding that his French isn't perfect. So in this clip, he describes a hardware shop where he often goes, and the main reason he goes isn't actually because he needs lots of hardware, it's because the staff are very friendly and put up with his French.
And so for several hours every day I was in Paris, David would walk me to the places he finds most interesting. And the first thing I learned was this. It is so traumatic to learn a new language that a lot of David's experience of the city, a lot of his personal geography of Paris, has to do simply with where people are cruel to him when he speaks and where they aren't.
This is a hardware store where the owner and the people who work there are really, really nice to me. I buy things here all the time. I buy things that I don't even need just because they're so kind, and they generally just start laughing right when I walk in the door. And then the owner will call his assistants out of the back room and say, he's back. And I buy things like, I bought a heating element so I could make tea in my hotel room because I had to go to Germany. So I could go in and say, hello, I am looking for a stick that make the water hot today. So I say like really stupid things when I go in there, but I only say it in French, but they're incredibly good sports. I bought an ironing board and I was able to say, hello, it has been 3 weeks, I bought an iron. Now, today, I look for a table that might work with my iron. Have you such a table? And he said, an ironing board, and went and got one out of the back. But he's really, really nice, and it's a place I can always count on where somebody's going to be good to me.
So the most interesting learning point for me from this clip wasn't actually any of the language. It was more about how this person goes about surviving in a foreign language. And so he's talking about describing objects that he doesn't know the name of in French. And this is something I think learners should also think about. You don't always have to have the perfect language to be able to say everything you're talking about. A lot of the time there's a way of describing something or talking about something where you can use the language you do know to express what you mean. And so this is something I always recommend to learners. And actually, knowing this skill is maybe more important in some situations than knowing lots and lots and lots of different words for things. Because if you can make your meaning clear to people, it doesn't necessarily matter if it looks perfect in most situations. In this last clip, David talks about what will happen when his French improves, and he's describing one of the reasons he moved to France, and that reason is that he wanted to experience something different from his home life in America. And so in this clip, he explains that if his French gets too good, living in Paris will get a bit too similar to living in America. One of the big differences he's explored a lot in this podcast is that his French isn't very good. So if his French gets too good, he thinks it's going to become too similar to living back home in America, and he'll lose one of the big reasons why he came over there in the first place. One of the other things he talks about in this clip is the idea that when you don't know what people are talking about, you kind of assume they're having really interesting conversations. And so maybe he's in Paris and he's imagining that people are talking about art and movies and TV. But actually, the more French he learns, the more he realizes that people don't have particularly interesting conversations in French. He's just imagining it.
Someday, David says, he'll be more comfortable in French. His accent will improve, and that daily anxiety will be removed from his life.
And when it is removed from me, then I probably won't be interested in living here anymore. I'll probably leave.
Because it'll be just like living back home.
Plus, the more you learn, the more disappointed you wind up being. It's easy to like somebody when you don't know what they're saying.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. That not understanding somebody makes them seem more interesting than they really are.
I just assumed that everyone talked about books and movies all the time. That's all they talked about as far as I was concerned. And then I learned a little bit more and I realized that they're no different than people anywhere else. They talk about the same banal things that we all talk about everywhere.
Two things stand out to me in this clip. The first is this kind of phrase. It's the more you learn, the more disappointed you end up being. And this is a really interesting and useful structure. So the more you something, the more you something else. And so we use this kind of phrase when increasing one thing also increases something else. So if I say, the more you practice, the better you get, what I'm saying is the more the amount of practice you have increases, the amount of skill you have will also increase in a similar amount. So when he says, the more you learn, the more disappointed you end up being, what he means is the more he can understand what people around him are saying, the more he finds out that actually those conversations are maybe a little bit boring for him. The second thing I wanted to point out in this clip is the word banal. And this word means something unoriginal, everyday, or maybe boring. And I think it's a really good word. It's a very powerful, interesting word that I'm going to try and use myself more often since I listened to this podcast. As he learns that people in Paris have the same everyday conversations as people everywhere else, he uses this word banal to describe those conversations. So now you've listened to 3 important parts of this podcast. So I really encourage you to go and take a listen to the whole thing. And I would say when you're listening to the whole thing, you might not understand every single sentence or every single word they say, but now that you have a general idea of what the topic is, you can kind of follow along to some bits of it. And as long as you're following along to some bits of it, you're learning, you're practicing listening, and you're going to get a lot of benefit from listening in this kind of way to authentic materials. So you can find a link to the podcast in the description. If you go to the This American Life website, you will also find a link to a transcript, which is going to have a complete text of the whole of the podcast. So if you find it a little bit difficult, do read along with the transcript at the same time as you listen. Do try slowing the podcast down. And also, it's very easy on podcast apps to just click the go back button and it will just take you back 15 seconds or 30 seconds and you can listen to something a couple of times until you really get it. But if you don't understand something, it's okay to just skip past it and not get too stressed about it. The most important thing is to try listening and to really enjoy listening. If you have any questions about anything, you can always leave a comment in the description, click like and click subscribe so you can get these videos delivered straight to you.